Hey everybody, welcome to a place probably a lot of you have not been before. We're right near the tunnel of Tunnel Hill, and we're at the Clisby Austin House. This was a headquarters for 1, 2, maybe 3 different officers during the Civil War, possibly even on both sides. This was a hospital after the Battle of Chickamauga. There's other things going on in and around this house, and Whitfield County does a great job interpreting the house and of course Tunnel Hill, on which we'll have a separate video, and maybe at the end of this one we'll show you something most of you probably haven't seen not far from this house as well. So to take us through this house and talk all about this, here's Dave Powell. God, I don't even know how to introduce him. Author of 1,600 books and a bunch of things on Chickamauga. Dave, take it away.
Good afternoon. We're here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon in Whitfield County. We are, as noted, at the Clisby Austin House. The Reverend Clisby Austin, an English Methodist minister, comes here before the Civil War. This is a well-established, fine brick home, and as such, it becomes a magnet for the armies when they finally get down here and start passing through. It has seen Confederate activity in 1863, right at the end of the Chickamauga campaign, or I'm sorry, the Chattanooga campaign. But really, the focal point of this house centers around 2 things. The first is the wounding and recuperation of Major General John Bell Hood, and we'll talk about that a little more as we get into the house. The second thing is that for approximately 5 days, from May 7th until May 12th, it is the nerve center, the command center for Sherman's combined armies of the Tennessee, of the Cumberland, and of the Ohio. Sherman's department or division of the Mississippi headquarters is right here in and around the Clisby Austin House. So why don't we go inside and take a look around?
Cool. We'll follow you on in, Dave, while I pan around. Beautiful countryside.
Today, the house is set up as a museum and interpretation center. This room, obviously, is devoted to General Sherman's headquarters. You can see the table, the field desk with Sherman sitting here, plotting with his maps. The very lifelike General Sherman. Staff officer around here in the corner, but it's furnished largely with period pieces from what I understand. And in order to interpret the medical side of our story, we'll come in here where a surgeon is addressing the wounded. This house first becomes a field hospital after the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. It's situated right next to the Western and Atlantic Railroad tracks so that soldiers can recuperate here until they're well enough to be moved south, further south to places like Kennesaw, Marietta, and Atlanta itself, where there are more substantial, more permanent hospitals. Immediately after Chickamauga, the South began to mobilize their resources for this huge influx of wounded. 18,454 Confederates fell, killed, wounded, or captured at Chattanooga. So there were something on the order of 12 or 13,000 Confederate wounded that needed to be treated. And then on top of that, there are 16,351 Federal killed, wounded, and captured. And at least 3,000 or 4,000 of those Federals also fall into Confederate hands. And so this massive, really disaster, this natural, or not natural disaster, man-made disaster of all these people who desperately needed care, creates this chain of hospitals that goes all the way back to Atlanta. Why don't we go upstairs and visit arguably the most famous of those patients that needs treatment? This room is set up to interpret the recovery of General John Bell Hood. On September 20th, 1863, Hood's right leg was injured. A musket ball struck his right leg, transversed the upper thigh, shattered the thigh bones, and necessitated an amputation very high up on almost within just a couple of inches of the hip. That's a very risky operation. Only about a 7% survival rate from treatment of that amputation. As a result, most people thought that Hood was going to die. As a matter of fact, the very early reports that come out of the Battle of Chickamauga, the first reports that appear in Confederate newspapers, all say that Hood was either killed or mortally wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. But Hood recovers. He shows amazing resilience. His leg is taken off in a field hospital out somewhere near Ringgold, where the First Corps hospitals are set up. And then he is moved down into Armuchee Valley, about 20 miles south of here, where he stays at the Colonel Little house. Colonel Little was a colonel in one of his Georgia regiments in Hood's division. He had been wounded at Chancellorsville and was already there recuperating, and so Hood's chief surgeon, John Darby, agrees to move Hood down with Colonel Little, and they recuperate there. And Hood will spend several days, almost a month, I believe, down in Armuchee Valley recuperating. And then when he's ready to return to Richmond, he will be brought back north out of Armuchee Valley here to the railroad, where he can then be safely transported first to Atlanta and ultimately to Richmond, where he will spend the winter of 1863-1864 recuperating in Richmond and spending a great deal of time with President Jefferson Davis.
Good, and as any good old historic house, you've got to see, you've got some sinks, you've got your mirror to clean up, and of course, everybody's favorite feature, the Potter chair.
So why don't we go back downstairs and we'll talk a little bit about the use of the house for a military headquarters. So Sherman's Department of the Mississippi headquarters is actually fairly small. The main logistical and administrative work of the Atlanta campaign is being conducted primarily by George H. Thomas's much larger Department of the Cumberland headquarters. And they have a field headquarters here, and further they have both Thomas and Sherman have administrative headquarters in Chattanooga and then further up at Nashville. Sherman's main departmental headquarters is actually in Nashville for almost the entire Atlanta campaign, but Sherman, of course, is here in the field. The work here of Sherman and his staff officers, this is the nerve center of the orchestration of nearly 100,000 men in three separate armies. The Army of Tennessee that numbers about 25,000 men, and the Army of the Cumberland, which numbers about 60,000 men, and finally the Army of the Ohio under John M. Schofield, which numbers about 15,000 men. And this vast amount of troops and wagons is all being moved initially towards Dalton. Later it will be moved down towards Resaca, Georgia, as Sherman confronts the defenses at Dalton, the very formidable Confederate defenses at Dalton, and then moves south, deciding to outflank those via the very famous maneuver of sending James B. McPherson and the Army of the Tennessee through Snake Creek Gap. But for about 5 days, this is Sherman's headquarters. He spends the nights here. He gets up every day, rides to the front, which is only a few miles away, confers with Thomas and Schofield and some of the corps commanders, and then rides back. This is where his telegraph has established communications back to Ringgold and ultimately all the way back to Washington, D.C., so he can remain in constant communication. And so this is where Sherman is going to spend a lot of time for the week of May 5 or May 7 through 12.
Very cool. We outside?
We outside.
All right, let's take it out here. You can see this is, as I said on the way in, just beautiful around here. And we're not going to walk all the way out, but what we're going to do is cut the video here. And then we are going to walk out to where you can see the train car in the distance. And then we're going to turn left along that road and we'll pick up in a moment. So here we are back out on the road, and if we were to walk just to the end right there and turn right, you'd be staring right at the tunnel, into Tunnel Hill, which you can maybe see above the trees over there. But the reason we wanted to come out here was to show you a marker that most people don't come to see. It hasn't been here all that long, 15 years or so. And Dave, give us an idea of what we're looking at here. I guess you can read what it says on there, y'all. But Dave, let's talk to us about that.
Well, when Hood's leg was amputated out closer to Ringgold in one of the field hospitals, because of Victorian burial customs and the image of a good death, Victorian wanted to be buried intact, all of his parts together. And so they took Hood's leg off, but then they kept it with him, certainly in the move down to Armuchee Valley, down to Colonel Little's house. Primarily because they expected him to die, and they wanted all of John Bell Hood to be buried together. Now, subsequently, when he recovered, and a number of interesting things happened when he was down there at Colonel Little's house. There's a great deal of mythology associated with Hood, and with the leg, and with Hood's infamous opium addiction, which you may have heard of. Interestingly enough, we have Surgeon Darby's journal, which tells us that Hood weaned himself off of opiates very quickly down there in Armuchee Valley, and was relatively pain-free and did not rely on opiates on a regular basis. But the leg traveled with him at least probably to Armuchee Valley. And from there, the story gets a little murkier. When Hood recovered and came north, one story has it that the leg came here with him and was brought with him as far as here, where it was buried, somewhere in the Clisby Austin, on the Clisby Austin farm. This modern marker, there's absolutely no way to be certain that this marks a spot where Hood's leg is buried. Another version of the story actually has Hood's leg entrusted to a staff member to take back to Texas, where Hood expected to be buried. And so that staff member came here, and this was as far as he was able to carry the leg before burying it, initially at least the thought is temporarily, so that in time it could be dug up and reinterred with the rest of General Hood, assuming that he passed. So the bottom line is we really have no idea where Hood's leg is, at least from a historical perspective. But there are several conflicting stories about how it might have got here to the Clisby Austin farm and how it's quite possibly buried on the property here.
Good, good. You ready to take this thing back from me?
Certainly.
All right. Sorry, I need to grab a cough drop during filming if you heard my crinkling around. So what I would say is, I don't think we talked about a single battle in particular on that whole video. What did we talk about? We talked about headquarters. We talked about hospitals. This is where the Civil War really played out, is on people's houses and farms and whatnot. Men, women, and children living their lives, having war disrupt those lives, and having the military machine come in and plan the next move. So we know you'll tell us if you like this sort of stuff or if you like just the blood and guts battle stuff a little bit more. But either way, we thank you for watching. And thank you for supporting battlefield preservation. And we'll leave with one last view of the Hood leg marker.
There you go.
Chris Mikowski of Emerging Civil War for the American Battlefield Trust, and I am having a fantastic time at the very peak of Rocky Face Ridge. And we're about to go from the great videos we've been talking about with Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and now we're shifting into 1864 and heading down toward the Atlanta campaign. And in order to get us from that spot, from this spot, down toward the direction of Atlanta, which is behind us, I'm going to ask my friend Will Green to come on here. And how is it that the armies end up along Rocky Face Ridge, and what do they think?
Well, the Confederates, of course, have suffered a terrible defeat at Missionary Ridge. They have fled off of the ridge, and they're heading back to the southeast, except for Pat Claiborne, relatively quickly. Braxton Bragg has finally outlasted his welcome, and he resigns from the Army. And his temporary replacement is William J. Hardee, a competent general who probably would have been a competent Army commander, but he begged off and said he would be willing to serve as an interim commander, but he was not interested in the job in a permanent way. The Army is headed for Dalton, Georgia, which is just behind Chris White's camera here, several miles back to the southeast of us here. And of course, the reason that Dalton was important, it was a railroad junction town, and it also was behind this strong position at Rocky Face Ridge. One of our videos will be on Tunnel Hill, and if you look over my shoulder, you'll see some red roofed buildings, and you can catch the railroad going around those red roof buildings to Tunnel Hill, where the campaign for Atlanta really begins. As Hardee decides that he is not going to be the permanent commander, President Davis has a tough decision to make. Who is he going to promote to replace his friend Braxton Bragg? And he swallows, I'm sure, very hard and selects Joseph Johnston, someone with whom he has not gotten along since 1861, as the new commander of the Army of Tennessee. And Johnston arrives in late December, makes his headquarters in Dalton, and immediately begins reinvigorating the Army of Tennessee. He does for that army what I think Joe Hooker did for the Army of the Potomac following the Fredericksburg debacle. And this army, which was routed and demoralized after the fighting at Chattanooga, becomes a strong fighting force in the period from December, January, and February 1864, while they're in winter camps all around Dalton. But that hiatus of combat is going to come to a brief end in late February of 1864, as George Thomas's army is going to probe toward the Confederate defenses here. And to talk about that action in February, let's bring on my friend Dave Powell.
So, good afternoon. Welcome to Dalton. Welcome to Rocky Face Ridge. In February 1864, General Grant was headquartered in Nashville. General Sherman was executing a large-scale raid going to Meridian, Mississippi. And in response to that, the Confederates here at Dalton the Confederate government actually ordered Joe Johnson to detach 3 divisions and send them to Mississippi. Grant gets word of that movement, or intelligence of that movement, and immediately contacts George Thomas and starts to push him to probe here against Dalton in order to recall those troops. He doesn't want a large force gathering against Sherman out in Mississippi. And so while Johnson's troops are departing, boarding the railroad, General Thomas sends John Macaulay Palmer, commander of the 14th Corps, with 4 federal divisions to probe against Mill Creek Gap down here and down across Rocky Face Ridge up here into Crow Valley. Initially, Thomas is actually ill in late February, and so he's not going to command the operation in person. So on the first day of the operation, it is actually General Palmer's operation. It very quickly runs into the Rocky Face Ridge position. The Federals coming down from Crow Valley do catch the Confederates by surprise a little bit. Confederate troops have been oriented to defend along Rocky Face and control the railroad. When 2 Federal divisions appear in Crow Valley, then Johnson has to reorient some of those troops. And there's some fighting on February 27th down in Crow Valley. George Thomas comes up that day. He's feeling a little better. He very quickly determines, after a couple of days of skirmishing, that he's not going to be able to take Rocky Face Ridge. Now that we've shown it to you, I think you know why. He's not going to be able to accomplish that much in Crow Valley either, because he doesn't, at this time, have a large army. His army in February is right in the middle of veteran furloughs, where the men re-enlist and then they get to go home. And thousands of federal soldiers are actually back home in Iowa, Indiana, Illinois on veteran furloughs. So Thomas's formations are very small at that time. The probe ends after a couple of days. Thomas goes back to Chattanooga to his headquarters. The one thing he has determined from the February probe is that the best way around or through Rocky Face Ridge is actually around Rocky Face Ridge, and he will be one of the first people to propose the idea of using Snake Creek Gap to bypass the Confederate position here at Dalton. That's probably the most significant takeaway from the February probe.
I think, too, that there's a key takeaway for Grant, because remember, this all takes place in February. What happens in March? He gets promoted to lieutenant general, heads off to Washington. And what is his grand strategy? Well, one of the things he learns here is if things get quiet, Confederates want to shift guys from here to there. What happened just prior to Chattanooga in the fall? Oh gosh, the Confederates sent Longstreet down and to turn the tide at the Battle of Chickamauga. The Federals shift the 11th and 12th Corps down to help him out. So he understands in these quiet times, the armies tend to shift, and the Confederates take advantage of that by using their interior lines to shift troops even from one theater to another. And so when Grant takes command as lieutenant general, his grand strategy is to make sure all his armies move all at once, all across the map, and tie those Confederates down everywhere so they can't shift. And part of that is a lesson that he takes away from his experience here in Chattanooga. So I'm going to ask Will to come on here, and if Dave's got any final thoughts, but we're going to continue talking about Rocky Face Ridge in one of our further videos. But as we're still here, other thoughts?
Well, I don't know if we have pointed out one of the landmarks of the Rocky Face campaign, but that small hill that you see off here to my left is Blue Mountain, and it was the place where General Sherman would ride out from the Clisby Austin house at Tunnel Hill and observe what was going on here during the demonstrations at Rocky Face Ridge. He would then return to the Clisby Austin house, sleep about 2 hours, and begin giving orders to all of his subordinate generals as to what he wanted done. So Rocky Face Ridge, just to wrap up, is one of the most important places that you're going to see in Northwest Georgia. It's now going to be accessible through the Rocky Face Ridge Park, and we certainly hope that you will take the opportunity when you're in this vicinity to come down and visit this remarkable historical resource that we hope these videos have helped you to understand.
And just one quick final word here before we leave. I want to bring on historian Bob Jenkins, who has done a lot to help with the interpretation here. Any quick thoughts before we head off to our next spot where he's going to take the limelight?
Sure. Where you've been standing during the May action is part of Cheatham's division line, and it was along this line that General Johnston, one day between the 8th of May and 12th of May, that Johnston had a horse shot out from under him. So imagine Sherman at Blue Mountain and Johnston right here, literally the two commanders looking across I-75 in the field at each other. Johnston was in a dilemma once the battle at Dug Gap happened on May 8, followed by the Snake Creek Gap surprise on the 8th and into the 9th of May by McPherson's army, which was making a dash toward Resaca on May the 9th. Johnston was not sure whether Sherman meant to still attack Dalton from the north and east, or if he was going for as far west as Rome to get in his back door and cut his line at the Western and Atlantic Railroad. So for the next 4 or 5 days, Johnston is shuttling forces, including portions of Claiborne's division, Walker's division, even Cheatham's division that was here. He had beefed up his mountaintops here when he saw Sherman came here with 80,000, But then he began to move back and forth, shuttling, with a division or two halfway to Resaca at Tilton, and a couple of divisions in Crow Valley, and another couple of divisions, Bate and Stewart, behind me in Mill Creek Gap. And so Johnston was unclear until the morning of the 12th of May, when he sends Hood with Hyman's division, supported by portions of Walker's division, which is shuttled back from Resaca and Calhoun and Tilton back into Crow Valley, and with General Hood leading and General Wheeler making a dash toward Varnell Station to see if Sherman was still here in force. They surprise a detachment of General Stoneman's cavalry division, and they find that most of Sherman has left. And so that evening, Johnston orders his withdrawal on the evening of the 12th, morning of the 13th of May, to get to Resaca.
So you're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're on top of Rocky Face Ridge, and as we take a look at this wonderful panoramic, we can see Kennesaw Mountain off in that direction. We can see as far as North Carolina in that direction. Lookout Mountain off in that direction, Ringgold Gap. What a fantastic view. I hope that you come here and see this for yourself. It's a wonderful park. It's an absolute treasure to be here. Thank you for allowing us to be here. I want to thank Chris White behind the camera. I want to thank Bob. I want to thank Will. I want to thank Dave. I want to thank Gary Edelman, who's playing human windshield right now. And I want to thank you for all you do to support us and support battlefield preservation and education.